July 1209. Southern France. The city of Béziers stood at the center of a storm that would soon become one of the most appalling massacres in medieval European history. What could compel an army, claiming to act in the name of God, to slaughter an entire city, regardless of age, gender, or faith? The answer lies in the violent collision between the Catholic Church and a heresy it feared above all others, Catharism. Known as good Christians by their followers, the Cathars rejected the authority of the Catholic clergy, denounced materialism, and promoted a radically dualistic view of good and evil. To the Church, they were not just heretics, they were an existential threat. In 1208, Pope Innocent III declared a crusade not against Muslims in the Holy Land, but against fellow Christians in southern France. His goal: eradicate the Cathar heresy. This Albigensian Crusade would be unlike anything Europe had seen before. The crusading army, made up of northern French nobles, mercenaries, and zealots, marched toward Béziers. The city, known for its Cathar sympathies, also housed thousands of Catholics. Yet the distinction between heretic and faithful would soon vanish in blood. At the center of this unfolding tragedy was Arnaud Amalric, the papal legate appointed by Innocent III to lead the campaign. As his forces approached Béziers, they demanded the city surrender its heretics. The population refused. What happened next became infamous. When asked how to distinguish heretics from Catholics in the chaos of battle, Amalric allegedly gave a chilling reply: Cadet eos. Navit enim dominus cassantius. Kill them all. God will know his own. Although the accuracy of this quote is debated, it was recorded by Caesarius of Heisterbach, a Cistercian chronicler writing within living memory of the event. Whether Amalric said these words or not, his army acted as though he had. No negotiation. No mercy. Only fire and steel. Béziers was about to be annihilated. Crusaders breached Béziers without resistance. At dawn on July 22, 1209, the crusading army encamped outside the walls of Béziers, expecting a long siege. The city's defenses were solid, its people defiant. Yet what unfolded defied every expectation and led to catastrophe. Inside Béziers, tensions were rising. The city's population of roughly 10,000 to 14,000 included not only Cathar sympathizers but also a majority of Catholic civilians, merchants, artisans, and clergy. Many believed their own religious standing or status would shield them from harm. Others, particularly the Cathars and their allies, refused to comply with the Crusaders' demand to hand over all heretics. What no one knew was that the fate of the city would be decided not by strategy or siegecraft, but by a spontaneous act of defiance. As the Crusaders prepared for a prolonged encampment, a small group of young men from Béziers, likely overconfident or enraged, charged out through a side gate and attacked a handful of Crusader scouts. What began as a minor skirmish spiraled out of control. The Crusader army, sensing disarray or an unexpected opportunity, surged forward. Shouting war cries, they advanced in force toward the walls. The city guard, unprepared for a full-scale assault, failed to seal the breach. In a matter of hours, Béziers was overrun, without siege engines, without ladders, and without resistance organized enough to repel the chaos. Arnaud Amalric later claimed in a letter to Pope Innocent III that the Crusaders entered the city without consulting anyone, without waiting for orders, as if driven by divine fury. Once inside, discipline collapsed. The crusade, supposedly aimed at rooting out heresy, devolved into uncontrolled slaughter. There was no distinction between heretic and believer, no effort to separate armed resistors from civilians. Men were cut down in the streets. Women, children, the elderly, none were spared. Houses were looted, churches desecrated, and blood ran through the alleyways of one of Languedoc's proudest cities. Amalric, in his letter to the Pope, stated that almost 20,000 citizens were put to the sword, regardless of age or sex. While this number may be inflated, even the most conservative estimates place the death toll in the thousands. For a single day's carnage in a medieval European city, it was unparalleled. The plundering of Béziers churches and monasteries. As Béziers descended into chaos, its sacred spaces, once considered untouchable, became targets of looting, desecration, and slaughter. Among the most tragic ironies of the massacre was that churches and monasteries, symbols of Christian sanctity, offered no protection from the fury unleashed by a crusade declared in Christ's name. When the Crusaders breached the city walls, hundreds of civilians fled into the Church of St. Mary Magdalene, a Romanesque structure that had stood for generations. They sought sanctuary under its vaulted arches, clinging to hope that the sanctity of a holy place would stay the sword. But in Béziers, no sanctuary was honored. According to multiple accounts, including that of Caesarius of Heisterbach, the Crusaders set fire to the church with all those inside. The flames consumed not only Cathars but also countless Catholics, men, women, and children who had begged for mercy within consecrated walls. Bones and ash would later be found mingled where the altar once stood. Other holy sites across the city fared no better. Monasteries, chapels, and ecclesiastical buildings were ransacked and looted. Precious reliquaries, chalices, and manuscripts many centuries old were seized or destroyed. Monks and clergy, if suspected of harboring sympathy for heretics, were not spared. Even those with no links to the Cathars were sometimes slain in the indiscriminate carnage. The crusade had been proclaimed a holy war, authorized by the Pope and sanctioned by indulgences. Yet inside Béziers, it became clear the destruction was not limited to heresy, it extended to holiness itself. Arnaud Amalric, who had once held the city's sacred spaces in esteem, expressed no regret in his report to the Pope. Instead, he celebrated the city's fall as a divine victory. But what had truly fallen was not just Béziers, it was the boundary between piety and brutality. In the name of faith, even the house of God had been turned into a furnace of death. The burning and abandonment of the city. By nightfall on July 22, 1209, Béziers was no longer a city, it was a smoldering ruin. Once home to merchants, nobles, artisans, and clergy, it had been transformed in a single day into a charred graveyard of collapsed homes, burned churches, and mutilated corpses. The massacre was complete, but the destruction was not yet over. With the population annihilated and resistance crushed, the Crusaders turned their attention to systematic destruction. Fires were lit across the city, not as an accident of battle, but as a deliberate act of erasure. Entire quarters were engulfed in flames. Stone buildings cracked in the heat, while timber structures were reduced to ash. Even the cathedral and other churches were not spared, despite their religious significance. According to Arnaud Amalric's own account, the city was pillaged and burnt. The few survivors, those who had fled before the Crusaders arrived or hidden in the surrounding countryside, emerged only to find that their homes no longer existed. The city that had stood for centuries, a proud part of the Languedoc region, was abandoned, lifeless, and blackened by fire. For the crusading forces, Béziers had served its purpose, a horrifying example. The massacre was meant to send a message to other cities in the region suspected of harboring heretics. Surrender or suffer the same fate. The psychological effect was immediate. As the army marched onward, many towns, Carcassonne among them, surrendered without resistance, terrified of sharing Béziers' fate. In the end, the destruction of Béziers was not a battle, nor a siege, it was an execution. It marked a grim new chapter in the Albigensian Crusade, one in which the lines between justice and vengeance, heresy and orthodoxy, were consumed in fire. And the city of Béziers, once thriving, was left behind, silent, scorched, and emptied of life. Comment below, do you think the massacre of Béziers was driven more by religious ideology or political domination, and could anything have stopped it once it began? Caesarius of Heisterbach recorded of Arnaud Amalric's infamous reply, "Kill them all. God will know his own." History remembers. Even when mercy does not.